distinguished delegates, esteemed colleagues, thank you very much for taking your time and coming to our side event organized by ALLATRA, Global Research Center. It carries a title from stigmatization to ill treatment, lessons from Russia and beyond, early warning signs, human dignity, and the prevention of abuse. My name is Vladimir Ivanov and I'm representative of ALLATRA GRC. As a lawyer and former arbitration judge whose practice is deeply rooted in the European Court of Human Rights litigation, I'm structurally trained to look at human rights through the lens of concrete violations, evidence, and post facto legal remedies. However, preventive human rights monitoring requires us to look further upstream. History and contemporary international jurisprudence teach us a sobering lesson. Systematic ill treatment, unlawful detentions, and the erosion of fundamental freedoms rarely begin with physical violence. They begin with words, with institutional labels. In legal practice, we frequently measure cumulative harm in financial or physical terms. But in the realm of human rights, cumulative harm manifests as gradual, calculated dismantling of an individual's or a group's legal standing. The pipeline from rhetoric to abuse follows a distinct pattern. It starts with targeted, stigmatizing labeling. When a civil society organization, a spiritual movement, or a minority group is systematically branded by public figures or state-aligned media as subversive or antisocial or cult or sect, the objective is dehumanization. Once dehumanization occurs, the targeted group loses its human face in the public consciousness. They are no longer viewed as citizens possessing inherent, non-derogable rights under the Helsinki Final Act. They are reframed as an existential threat that must be neutralized. Within this side event, together with esteemed speakers, we will present here or online, and we decided to set up such an objective to address a critical question within the OVCE mandate. At what precise point does social stigmatization transform into a systematic human rights risk? This panel brings forward empirical realities from across the OVCE region and beyond. Our first speaker could not join us live today. Therefore, we will hear a pre-recorded contribution from an esteemed participant from Italy, Mr. Alberto Conto, who focuses in his work on fundamental rights, constitutional guarantees, and democratic governance. Following case studies, we will start with the very center of the European democracy, Belgium, presented by Dr. Aisha Basha, researcher and political scientist. Next, we will witness a severe ongoing crackdown on civil society in Russia. Due to the critical safety and protection concerns, we cannot publicly disclose the identity of our online participant, a researcher from ALLATRA GRC, who has directly suffered from Russian state persecution. Her situation is a stark reminder of the human cost when state apparatuses weaponize narratives. Our next speaker, Mr. Leos Strand, spokesperson for Falun Dafa movement in the Czech Republic, will address reported contemporary patterns of stigmatizing and dehumanizing narratives concerning the Falun Dafa practitioners. His contribution will focus in particular on concerns regarding the circulation and possible adaptation of such narratives beyond China, including in democratic information spaces and on their reported consequences for individuals and communities. Following these interventions, I will address the stage of institutional pressure that may precede open repression, together with Ms. Maria Anna Prejcik, lawyer and legal researcher focusing on international and European law, also representing the ALLATRA GRC. We will then address a common principle of these case studies, laying in coordinated stigmatizing labeling practice, in certain cases extending into transnational repression. Finally, I will give a floor to Evgenia Maleska, lawyer and former law enforcement officer, to uncover a concept of her legal research, which deeply unmantles coordinated stigmatization as a dehumanizing practice intentionally used to polarize public discourse. Now, we will hear a word from Mr. Alberto Conto.
It's a privilege to address you, albeit through this recorded message, at the site event From Stigmatization to Free Treatment, Lessons from Russia and Beyond, Early Warning Signs, Human Dignity and the Prevention of Abuse, organized within the framework of the OVCE Human Dimension discussion in Vienna. I sincerely regret not being able to participate in person, but I greatly appreciate the opportunity to contribute to this significant discussion. The subject of this side event is particularly important from the standpoint of fundamental rights, constitutional protection, democratic institution, and the safeguarding of human dignity. I am Alberto Contu, a researcher, legal philosopher, and federalism scholar. I am an author, expert in legal hermeneutics, behavioral neurosciences, senior advisor at the Institute for Advanced Student and Cooperation. Stigmatization is a very vague concept, encompassing a wide range of conditions. 1. Characterizing individuals and groups based on an ethnic item and deriving presumed anthropological defects or pathological deviations. 2. Using stereotypes to make unwarranted generalization based on characteristics presumed to define individuals and groups. 3rd, classifying individuals and groups based on socio-biological connotation on presumed characteristics, resulting in differential racism. For example, in Sardinia, for centuries, we have suffered a very particular stigma, shepherds. But behind the word with a 1,000-year-old and noble tradition lies the prejudice that pastoralism is the cause of banditry and kidnapping. Consequently, other Italian regions have implemented unconstitutional administrative measures, such as the registration of immigrant Sardinian shepherds, considered a potential criminal group. In contemporary history, we have seen striking cases of emerging legislation passed ad hoc against areas with high pastoral density. All security legislation forgets that fundamental rights preexist the legitimacy of the state, and that a democratic constitution must incorporate these universal values. On this, as in Article 3 of the Italian Constitution, is the prohibition of discrimination based on race, religion, social status, culture, and so on. But jurists know that statements of principle are one thing, and the ways in which rights can be exercised are another. Legal sociologists know even better that what makes the difference as practices. I think about police, courts, public administrations, local and national governments. We need to move beyond the criminal law of suspicion, typical of inquisitorial system, and spread the culture of due process at all levels. Power must be subordinate to rights.
We thank very much to Mr. Contu. His remarks did remind us that the constitutional guarantees and the principle of non-discrimination cannot remain merely statements of principle. Their real value depends on how they are applied in everyday practice by public administrations, the courts, the law enforcement bodies and other institutions. As Mr. Contu has underlined in his speech, one of the central risks arises when suspicion replaces evidence, when stereotypes replace individual assessment, and when public authorities begin to treat people not on the basis of their conduct, but on the basis of assumed characteristics, social origin, beliefs, or group affiliation. I now would like to invite Dr. Aisha Basha to follow with her contribution.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the organizer, ALLATRA, for the kind invitation to this event. It is both privilege and responsibility to speak today from Brussels, the capital of Europe, the seat of multilateral dialogue, and a city that has for generations opened its arms to the world. In line with perspective shared by the previous panelists, I will address the case of Belgium. I want to begin with a tribute because Belgium deserves one. In the landscape of nations, Belgium occupies a singular and admirable place. It is a country that has built over decades one of the most sophisticated legal architectures for human rights protection on the continent. A country that houses not only the European institutions, but the spirit they were built to embody: dialogue over confrontation, inclusion over exclusion, shared humanity over narrow identity. Belgium, by design and by vocation, a land of tolerance. Its federal structure is itself a daily negotiation between communities, languages, and identities, a living demonstration that difference need not mean division. Its civil society is vibrant, its academic tradition is rigorous, its international commitments are sincere. On the global stage, Belgium punches well above its weight as a voice for human dignity, development cooperation, and the rule of law. These are not small achievements. They are the fruit of a long and deliberate effort, and they deserve to be named clearly and with respect. And yet, precisely because Belgium's values are so clearly stated, precisely because its ambitions are so genuinely high, it falls upon us as citizens, as partners, and as observers committed to the same ideals to speak honestly about gap that remains between the promise and the practice, between the principle and the lived experience, between the Belgian that opens its doors to the world and the Belgian that too often does not fully open those doors to the people who already live within it. I'm speaking specifically about access to public employment. Let me, ladies and gentlemen, be clear about what the data tell us, and it's Belgium's own data produced by Belgium's own institutions. UNIA, the Interfederal Center for Equal Opportunities, has documented through rigorous CV testing studies that candidates with Arabic of African sounding names receive between 30 and 50% fewer callbacks than candidates with the identical qualification and identical applications, differing only in their name, not in their degrees, not in their experiences, not in their skills, in their name alone, ladies and gentlemen. In a country where nearly a quarter of the Brussels population is of non-European origin, the representation of these communities in senior public administrations roles remain strikingly thin. The institutions that govern, administer and serve this diverse population don't yet fully reflect it. This is not a minor administrative oversight. It is a structural contradiction, one that risks undermining the very values Belgium so rightly champions. There is a young woman, I think of her when I speak about this subject. I will call her here Fatima. She is born in Brussels, educated in Brussels, fluent in 4 languages, a law graduate with distinction from a Belgian university, a volunteer in legal aid services for more than 5 years. She applied 70 times for a position in the Belgian Federal Public Service. 70 times, ladies and gentlemen. She told me after a while, you stop reading the rejection letters, not because it doesn't hurt you, but because they all say the same things, and none of them overstate the real reason. That is what we call the invisible violence. Fatima is not grievance. Fatima is a loss of talent, of energy, of civic engagement, born by a young Belgian woman who wanted nothing more than to serve her country, and the country that prides itself on tolerance paid the price of its own inconsistency. Distinguished colleagues, when a state's public institutions are not accessible to all its citizens on equal terms, it is merely a question of fairness. True, it is emphatically that. It is a question of policy effectiveness. Inclusive public institutions are more responsive institutions. They understand better the community they serve. They design better policies. They build greater public trust. The diversity in public service is not concession to identity politics. It is prerequisite for a good governance. And conversely, when communities see themselves systematically absent from the institution that govern them, the signal received, it is clear and profound one. It says your participation is welcome in some spaces, but not in the spaces that matter most. That signal erodes confidence, it distances citizens from institutions, and it quickly fractures the social contrast. Belgium has invested enormously in the rhetoric of inclusion. The time has come to match that rhetoric with structural reform. Its requirement practices in their diversity accountability, in the genuine openness of public institutions to all those who are qualified, committed, and Belgium. I see this not as a critic, but as a partner. Our organization, the OVCE, exists precisely to build bridges between policy and practices, between the ideals we proclaim and the realities we must construct together. Belgium has every reason to be proud of what it has built and every reason to go further. The most tolerant nation in the world should also be the most consistent one. Its public service should be mirror of its people, of all its people, and its policies should be an inclusive in practice as they are in principles. That is not an indictment, it is an invitation to close the gap between Belgium's promise and Belgium's full potential. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Basha, for this important contribution. You have shown that stigmatizing narratives are not merely a matter of public language or disagreement. They can affect social cohesion, equal participation, access to opportunities, and the security of vulnerable groups long before any formal restriction of rights becomes visible. In other words, ill treatment with groups or individuals in broader understanding. We will now move from this political and social perspective to a personal testimony from the Russian context. For security reasons, we will not publicly disclose the identity of our next online participant. Her testimony will address the human consequences that may arise when stigmatizing narratives are no longer confined to public discourse but become reinforced through institutional pressure and persecution. Thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
I'm here to share my personal story, the circumstances that forced me to leave my country of origin, and the reasons why I was strongly advised not to return. Today, I will speak not only about my own case, but also about what I have learned through both public information and personal knowledge regarding the experiences of other former volunteers of the ALLATRA Global Civic Platform. I hold a master's degree in geology and have worked as geophysicist since 2012. I have been a volunteer with ALLATRA since February 2019. ALLATRA is an international volunteer civic platform with participants from more than 180 countries and US-based institutional presence. ALLATRA brings together volunteers, specialists, and public interest across working on climate and environmental awarenesses, nanoplastics and public health communication, human rights, civic diplomacy in dialogue across cultures and communities. My work within ALLATRA involved analyzing scientific climate data, writing analytical articles, preparing presentations, and organizing scientific conferences. All of this was done on a voluntarily basis in fully compliance with the constitution of my homeland. Our scientific work was based on research from leading global institutions and independent scientific sources. Although ALLATRA is engaged exclusively in peaceful activities focused on climate change and global environmental challenges, its volunteers on my country faced years of systematic pressure, which escalated into an active persecution over the past several years. Why? Because we were inconvenient for an authoritarian system. We stood for democratic principles, we spoke about human rights, we brought people together, not against the state, but to address global challenges. A coordinated campaign to discredit ALLATRA began as early as 2015. For 7 years, defamatory materials about us were regularly published in the media. We were deliberately branded a destructive sect and an apocalyptic cult, not because those labels reflected reality, but because they served to create the image of an enemy. The label of an apocalyptic cult was applied because we openly discussed the climate crisis based on independent scientific research. The label of sect was used because the movement united people from more than 180 countries, something that, in an increasingly authoritarian environment, was itself perceived as a threat. August 8, 2023 was the day that changed everything. On that day, without presenting any credible evidence, the country's Prosecutor General's office designated ALLATRA as an undesirable organization, accusing its participants of coercing citizens into extremist activities and spreading false information. Since August 8, 2023, ALLATRA has conducted no activities whatsoever in the country, and none continue there to this day. We ceased all activities, but that is when the persecution and raids began. Not investigations, not inspections, raids carried out by masked, heavily armed officers who forced their way into homes, seized computers, phones, and personal documents. What followed was fabricated evidence, interrogations accompanied by signs of torture, and accusations of supporting a foreign state. On June 5, 2024, I was outside the country on vacation. At 6:30 a.m., a group of approximately 15 people stormed my apartment. According to my neighbors, they were OMO riot police in full tactical gear, wearing masks and carrying our assault rifles, accompanied by officers from the security services. According to eyewitnesses, they acted as if carrying out a high-risk arrest. They gave no prior notice, made no attempt to contact me, and did not wait for a legal representative. They forcibly broke down my apartment door and conducted a search. Those who organized the raid should have known that I was abroad and not at home. Nevertheless, an armed unit deliberately forced its way in during the early morning hours, making as much noise as possible. There was no operational necessity for such a show of force. I believe it was intended as a public demonstration for my neighbors, portraying me as a dangerous person. Thank God, my family was not at home. I called them immediately and asked them not to return. The special force unit remained in the empty apartment for 3 hours. They turned over belongings, seized documents, and threw books on the floor. No court order for the search was presented. No grounds were explained. To my knowledge, similar violence raids were carried out that same day at 4 other apartments belonging to former ALLATRA volunteers. All of them had previously been active in the civic platform, yet none had engaged in any ALLATRA-related activities for nearly a year after the organization had been designated as undesirable. Let me give a specific example. Yelena, a teacher with a master's degree in philology, was at home with her sister when officers arrived. They were not shown any legal documents authorizing the raid. When they didn't open the door, OMO officers cut through the lock and forcibly entered the apartment. Both women were forced to the floor face down. For more than an hour, Yelena's sister was held with her hands behind her back at gunpoint. When they asked for a lawyer, their request was denied. Their phones were confiscated immediately. The entire operation was filmed for a media segment that later portrayed those defenseless women as terrorists. Everyone whose homes were raided that day was formally detained as a witness. In reality, however, the security services interrogated them as they were criminals. During questioning, they were intimidated and pressured to provide false testimony. As Yelena told me directly, the investigators said to her, "You are not allowed to talk about climate. The topic is forbidden." She later wrote to me, "After everything that happened, I still have trouble sleeping." 3 of the participants were released that evening after hours of exhausting interrogations. They immediately fled the country, believing there was a high likelihood that they would soon be arrested. One of them, however, was not released. Criminal charges were filed against him. He is a professional photographer, the recipient of numerous national and international photography awards, and member of the country's Union of Journalists. He spent an entire year in prison under harsh conditions and constant pressure while awaiting the outcome of his case. What happened to us in 2024 was not an isolated incident. It was part of a systematic campaign unfolding simultaneously across the entire country. 2 months later, in August 2024, a new wave of raids targeted the homes of former ALLATRA volunteers across the country. We learned much later through indirect sources what had taken place during interrogations in one of the regions. People were tortured. They were subjected to electric shocks, and plastic bags were placed over their heads. Through the same sources, I also learned that the investigative authorities intended to open a criminal case against one of the victims. However, the investigative committee refused to proceed. According to an official from the agency, the reason was that the victim's body bore visible signs of torture. When we tried to reach people from that region, they either didn't respond at all or said briefly, "It is better that you do not know what we went through." A new wave of raids swept through the capital in December. 10 people were detained simultaneously. Criminal cases were opened against each of them. Physical force and violence were used during the searches. Camera crews arrived alongside the security forces. Media outlets published dehumanizing reports that same day. All of these people, participants of the ALLATRA civic platform, had ceased any involvement in the platform long before the raids. According to available information, none of them had engaged in any activity for at least a year prior. In June 2025, the country's General Prosecutor's Office declared ALLATRA an extremist organization. This marked a turning point. It meant that any mention of the ALLATRA civic platform in my home country could now be treated as a criminal offense. Reports of new arrests and criminal cases continue to emerge, and innocent people are still being detained. Yet, with each passing month, less information reaches us. People remain silent out of the fear because they are isolated or because they have no access to a phone or lawyer. A significant number of former ALLATRA volunteers fled the country after the raids began because staying meant exposing themselves to a very real danger. We do not know the full scale of what is happening. That uncertainty is itself part of the tragedy we have experienced. People who volunteered to address climate-related issues have been falsely labeled as terrorists under the law. My attorney gave me a clear warning. Do not return. You will be detained and imprisoned. The charge carries a sentence of 6 years. I am not a politician. I am a geologist and geophysicist. I organized climate conferences and worked with scientific papers. That is all what I did. For that, 15 armed and masked men broke down the door of my apartment. I love my family, my friends, and I miss my homeland, but I cannot live there because I fear for my life. I think about those who remained behind, about those who wrote to me, "It is better that you do not know what we went through," about those who no longer write at all, because their phones have been seized, or because they are afraid, or because they have simply disappeared from sight. I'm here to bear witness, so that the world may know it is happening. This is happening now. For people like us, returning home means getting imprisoned. And this can happen to anyone who believes in democracy, freedom of speech, and freedom of conscience. Thank you for giving me opportunity to be heard.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing this difficult and deeply personal testimony. Your contribution reminds us that behind terms such as stigmatization, institutional pressure, and erosion of safeguards are real people whose safety, dignity, family life, professional opportunities, and ability to live freely may be affected. We will now broaden the comparative perspective. Our next speaker, Mr. Leos Strnad, spokesperson for Falun Dafa movement in the Czech Republic, will address reported contemporary patterns of stigmatizing and dehumanizing narratives concerning Falun Dafa practitioners. Falun Dafa, also known as Falun Gong, is a spiritual practice originating in China that has been subject to severe repression since 1999, including reports by International Organization of Arbitrary Detention, torture, and other serious human rights violations. There have also been persistent and widely documented allegations of forced organ harvesting from detained practitioners, which have raised significant concern among human rights experts and institutions. He will focus particularly on concerns regarding the circulation and possible adaptation of such narratives beyond China, including within democratic intervention environments and on their reported consequences for individuals and communities. Mr. Strnad, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Leos Strnad, and I am a spokesperson of the Falun Dafa Association in the Czech Republic. My remarks focus on a dimension of persecution that is increasingly relevant to the prevention of torture and ill treatment, transnational repression. For more than 2 decades, Falun Gong practitioners in China have faced arbitrary detention, coercive transformation, torture, and other grave abuses because of their spiritual belief. But repression does not stop at China's borders. In recent years, this repression has taken on an additional form outside China, efforts to discredit Falun Gong communities and to sabotage Shenyun Performing Arts, a cultural company founded by Falun Gong practitioners. In June 2025, the G7 leaders described transnational repression as a form of foreign interference in which states or their proxies intimidate, harass, harm, or coerce people outside their own borders. This is highly relevant to our discussion today. Torture prevention cannot begin only after a person is placed in a prison cell. It must also address the broader machinery of persecution. That is, intimidation, surveillance, threats, smear campaigns, and attempts to isolate a community from public support. In the case of Falun Gong and Shenyun, we increasingly see this broader machinery operating in democratic societies. The objective is not only to silence individual practitioners, it is also to discredit their community, weaken cultural institutions associated with them, and make others hesitant to defend them. When we speak about torture and ill treatment, we naturally think about detention centers, police stations, interrogations, and prisons. But torture almost never begins there. It begins when a group is portrayed as dangerous, irrational, disloyal, and unworthy of protection. Inside China, Falun Gong practitioners were first subject to vast propaganda campaign. Their purpose was to turn neighbors, colleagues, relatives, police officers, judges, and doctors against them. Once people are deprived of their credibility and humanity in the public eye, it becomes much easier for authorities to isolate them, criminalize them, and subject them to abuse. Outside China, the methods may look different, but the logic can be similar. Falun Gong practitioners are targeted through disinformation, anonymous threats, social media manipulation, legal complaints, or misleading media narratives. I do not suggest that a smear campaign in a democratic country is identical to torture in a detention center. It is not. But it can be part of the same continuum of repression. Discredit the victim, isolate the victim, silence them, and make the victim less likely to receive protection. Therefore, an important question for torture prevention mechanism is this: can democratic societies recognize the early stages of persecution before intimidation and reputational destruction make future abuse invisible? The issue of transnational repression had already become an official topic of the G7 summit last year. In the statement, G7 explicitly condemned a wide array of authoritarian tactics, including physical violence and digital harassment such as smear campaigns. Since 2022, we see even stronger CCP campaign aimed at undermining Shenyun and Falun Gong internationally. The new strategy is not limited to one tactic. It combines several forms of pressure. The first is direct intimidation, bomb threats, shooting threats, threats to theaters, family members, even politicians. The second is disinformation, false narratives spread online, fake accounts, impersonation, and content designed to make Falun Gong or Shenyun appear dangerous or untrustworthy. The third is institutional pressure, attempts to persuade theaters, public bodies, journalists, or elected representatives to withdraw their support. The fourth is legal or administrative pressure, complaints, lawsuits, and allegations that may impose costs or reputational damage even when they do not succeed. What makes this dangerous is the combination. Threats create fear, smears erode sympathy, institutional complaints drain resources. A bomb threat can frighten a theater manager even if no bomb exists. A misleading allegation can make a journalist or a public official hesitate even if it's never proven. A false online identity can create confusion even if it's eventually exposed. Taken together, these tactics can create chilling effect. People become afraid to speak, afraid to host an event, afraid to support a targeted group. Our database currently records 298 threats against Falun Gong or Shenyun worldwide since March 2024. These numbers matter because the pressure does not need to succeed every time in order to have an effect. A bomb threat does not need to be carried out or to frighten a theater manager. A lawsuit does not need to succeed to consume resources and create instant reputational damage. A misleading article does not need to persuade everyone to make public officials more hesitant to offer support. On December 10, 2025, the Prague Congress Center received a letter calling for the cancellation of the upcoming Shenyun performance. Later in April this year, the Prague Congress Center received bomb threats if Shenyun Performing Arts show is not cancelled. Other recent incidents show the pressure on Falun Gong practitioners outside China is not limited to online smear or institutional interference. Only this year, the physical attacks occurred across several democratic countries. Practitioners of Falun Gong were assaulted in Jeju, South Korea. A woman was attacked outside a British Museum in London. A volunteer was stuck from behind at an informational stand in Flushing, New York, Chinatown. And a 70-year-old practitioner was assaulted in Southern Carolina. These are all very recent incidents, and they are all result of the atmosphere which was created by the smear campaigns and the hatred spread in not only online but in the society. The question is not only whether we recognize transnational repression. The question is whether democratic states can respond effectively and lawfully. The G7 has already identified several key directions: stronger international cooperation, better detection of digital threats, support for targeted communities, and accountability for perpetrators. For the Czech Republic and other democratic states, I would suggest 4 practical priorities. First, recognize the patterns. A threat, a fake letter, a hostile article, a legal complaint may appear unrelated when viewed separately, but authorities and institutions should be able to assess whether they form a part of broader campaign. Second, preserve evidence. Theaters, community organizers, journalists, and civil society groups should preserve emails, screenshots, technical data, correspondence, and timelines of suspicious incidents. Third, protect targeted people and institutions. This includes Falun Gong practitioners and even public officials who may face intimidation because of their association with the targeted community. Fourth, investigate and ensure accountability. Anonymous threats, impersonation, cyber harassment, and foreign pressure should not be dismissed as a mere controversy. They should be assessed as a potential threat to public safety, religious freedom, and national sovereignty. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Sternert, for your valuable contribution. The testimony we have heard from the Russian context and the example concerning the Falun Dafa practitioners arise from different political and legal environments. Yet both they illustrate a common risk. When people are reduced to hostile labels, they may gradually cease to be seen as equal right holders. Importantly, as Mr. Sternert reflected in his speech, these dynamics may not remain confined within national borders. Stigmatizing narratives can travel across jurisdictions, influencing perceptions, policies, and even forms of pressure exerted on individuals or communities abroad, including countries traditionally considered to be democratic. In this way, what begins as domestic rhetoric may contribute to patterns of transnational repression. The rhetoric employed against actors such as Falun Dafa and the Universal Peace Federation foundations, as well as against social organizations such as ALLATRA and other civil society actors involved in human rights protection, demonstrates striking similarities. Although these organizations differ significantly in their nature, objectives, and legal status, they have repeatedly been subjected to the same stigmatizing labels, most notably cult or sect, accompanied by narratives portraying them as socially dangerous, manipulative, or undeserving of legal protection. In our research, based on open source data, we started to document these similarities across various examples of stigmatization campaigns. Today we understand that such similarities are not merely coincidental. They reflect the activities of transnational anti-cult networks that have promoted common narratives across different jurisdictions. We uncovered the activity of interpersonally connected worldwide anti-cult network in deeper detail in our side event presented in May here in Vienna during the Supplementary Human Dimension Meeting 2. The recording of this side event is now available online. Let me briefly summarize what the anti-cult network is. For many years, Russia has promoted and supported networks commonly referred to as the anti-cult movement that operate beyond its borders. Within these networks, certain religious communities, civil society organizations, and even sport clubs have been portrayed as cults or sects or cult extremist entities, frequently without any adequate evidentiary basis at all. Parallels have been identified between earlier European approaches to categorizing religious minorities and more recent activities associated with figures such as Alexander Dworkin and the Russian Association of Centers for the Study of Religions and Sects, shortly RACIRS. In these contexts, labeling frameworks have been used to characterize selected religious or civic groups in highly negative terms, including as potential threats to society or national security. Actors employing this form of anti-cult rhetoric are active in a number of countries, including across Europe and the United States. Although their affiliations and approaches differ, they frequently rely on similar patterns of labeling that portray the targeted groups as inherently dangerous, manipulative, or socially harmful, thereby contributing to their delegitimization in the public sphere. Notably, the anti-cult movement has long been the subject of substantial academic criticism. Numerous scholars of religion, sociology, law, and human rights have described many of its core assumptions and methodologies as pseudo-scientific. Nevertheless, anti-cult narratives continue to be reproduced systematically in parts of the media and are repeatedly employed in public smear campaigns against a wide range of religious communities, civil society organizations, and other targeted groups, including political parties. Let me mention one notable example demonstrating interconnection and dehumanizing narratives of this network, which happened back in 2008. It was personally attended by the main ideologist of the worldwide spreading of anti-cult narratives, Alexander Dworkin, from this Russian Association for Studies of Religions and Sects, RACIRS. There, he marked an important stage in strengthening cooperation between Russian and Chinese anti-cult actors. After this conference, during which Alexander Dworkin explicitly supported the way of public persecution of Falun Dafa practitioners, labeled as dangerous sect, a renewed wave of Falun Dafa persecution followed. This example illustrates a possible mechanism how stigmatizing narratives cross national borders and subsequently influence institutional approaches in different countries. Whether the target is a spiritual movement, a civil society organization, or another lawful association, the underlying mechanism remains remarkably consistent. Coordinated labeling is followed by social stigmatization, institutional pressure, then restrictions on fundamental rights, and in the most severe cases, persecution. The cases discussed today illustrate the final stage of a process. Long before overt repression becomes visible, there is usually a period of stigmatization, moral panic, and growing institutional pressure. Only later do we see the forms of repression that attract international attention. If the democratic resilience fails, undemocratic laws are accepted, typically within a short framework without wider academic or professional discussion, thus reflecting the moral panic and institutional pressure escalation. This pattern can be observed in different political and legal environments. In Russia, restrictive legislation and expanding state control over civil society, including measures associated with the Yarovaya package and related regulatory frameworks, were similarly preceded by narratives portraying certain groups as threat to public order, national security, or social stability. The examples discussed today represent the very final stage of the process of dehumanization. At that point, legal remedies becomes increasingly limited because public perception has already been shaped, institutional decisions have already been justified, and the lives of the people change essentially. Their human rights are severely restricted. This is why attention must be paid to what happens earlier. And the principal question we would like to raise in the OVCE environment: what are the measurable warning signs that institutional pressure is replacing equal protection under the law? What happens to procedural safeguards when the people they are designed to protect are no longer perceived as equal right holders? Procedural safeguards do not function automatically. Their effectiveness depends on the professional independence of those responsible for implementing them. Lawyers must be willing to defend unpopular clients. Prosecutors must investigate allegations regardless of the identity of the victim, and judges must remain capable of excluding evidence obtained through coercion. At this moment, I would like to give the floor to Ms. Maria Anna Perejcik, legal researcher in international law and representative of the ALLATRA Global Research Center. Thank you.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, colleagues, I would like to build upon the important observations made by the previous speakers today and analyze the stigmatization phase preceding the institutional pressure and justified persecution into a deeper detail. We have just heard how stigmatizing labeling and institutional pressure often precede over-repression. At more advanced stage, labeling patterns evolve from targeted smear campaigns in a broader process of collective stigmatization. A specific recurrent linguistic tool in this phase that was repeatedly mentioned today and which can be observed also in many other cases is the use of labels such as sect or cult, which function as shortcuts for stigmatization, implying irrationality, danger, and incompatibility with normal society. Such a narrative is widely promoted by anti-cult rhetorics, followers of the anti-cult ideology, as mentioned by Vladimir already. While earlier stages aim to isolate specific targets, this level of escalation contributes to the construction of an enemy image at the societal and geopolitical levels. Even organizations such as Amnesty International and many others have at times been portrayed within certain information environments through narratives implying manipulation, hidden agendas, foreign control, or destructive influence. Narratives structurally corresponding to classical anti-cult framing. Increasingly, these mechanisms are also being directed against political parties and politicians. Once public discourse accepts the idea that certain group can be labeled as irrational, manipulative, dangerous, or socially toxic, in other words, a sect or a cult, the range of potential targets naturally broadens. The object of disinformation may become not just a specific individual or group, but entire nations, political systems, or cultural spheres. In our last side event, also mentioned by Vladimir, we broadly presented the Russian disinformation campaign orchestrated by Alexander Dworkin and his researchers together, actors of research together with certain stage, aimed at dehumanization of the Ukrainians in the eyes of the Russian public, labeling the whole state, all Ukraine, as a dangerous totalitarian sect or hypersect. Citizens of Ukraine were publicly labeled by another actor of research, archpriest Alexander Novopashin, as cannibals. This example illustrates that stigmatizing labels, when systematically repeated, amplified, they can contribute to the dehumanization of entire populations, reinforce hostility between communities, and normalize perceptions of certain groups as legitimate objects of suspicion or exclusion. As case we discussed today indicates that certain stigmatization campaigns either originate from or are being widely supported by Russian ideological center researchers, and its narratives are promoted and amplified by actors in the anti-cult network around the world. They use narratives adjusted for local audiences, but keep the goal the same: to delegitimize and dehumanize the target. The ODHR guidelines on the protection of human rights defenders contain an entire section entitled Confronting Stigmatization and Marginalization. This document recognizes that smear campaigns, stigmatization, discrimination, marginalization, and public discrediting create an unsafe environment for human rights work and undermine the exercise of fundamental freedoms. These guidelines further emphasize the responsibility of participating states to ensure a safe, enabling environment for human rights defenders and civil society actors. A decade later, the 2024 report of the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights to Freedom of Peaceful Assembly and of Association, Gina Romero, demonstrated that the problem has not diminished. Across different regions, civil society organizations, journalists, lawyers, religious communities, human rights defenders, and political opponents continue to be labeled as foreign agents, extremists, terrorists, threat to national security, or enemies of the state. So cases presented today reflect a phenomenon increasingly attracted attention of human rights defenders: transnational repression. Coordinated smear campaigns amplified through the international media ecosystems and advocacy networks can follow targeted individuals and organizations across jurisdictions, affecting their reputation, security, professional opportunities, and restricting the liability and their ability to access effective remedies. For this reason, systematic stigmatization should be viewed not merely as a challenge to civic space, but also as a factor directly relevant to torture prevention. And this is especially important where stigmatizing narratives can be traced to or are amplified by actors linked to the authoritarian information ecosystems, such as Russia in the case of ALLATRA. When democratic societies allow such narratives to circulate uncritically in the public sphere, they risk importing the frames that serve the interests of repressive regimes. The OVCE has long relied upon early warning mechanisms to identify conditions that increase the likelihood of conflict and human rights violations. A similar preventive approach can be applied here. There is also an important question of access to justice and effective remedies. In theory, organizations subjected to stigmatization may rely on right of reply, defamation proceedings, anti-discrimination protections, or other legal remedies, but in practice, these safeguards often become increasingly difficult to access once public awareness have already framed the targeted group as inherently suspicious or dangerous. An organization may formally possess the right to defend its reputation, yet if exercised that right, it requires litigation in multiple jurisdictions, hiring lawyers across several countries and diverting substantial resources away from its legitimate activities and aims, the remedy is becoming illusory. Civil society organizations, religious communities, and grassroots movements should not be forced to choose between pursuing their legitimate objects and defending themselves against endless campaign of public discrediting. This is precisely the type of chilling effect mentioned today by other speakers, and this chilling effect increasingly recognized by international human rights mechanisms. Allow me to conclude with several questions to reflection. If we agree that torture, ill treatment, and persecution rarely emerge suddenly, at what stage should preventive action begin? Where is the boundary between criticism protected by freedom of expression and practices that amount to the dehumanization, discrimination, and social exclusion? What are the red flags that should already raise concern and attract immediately the attention of human rights defenders? If we are genuinely committed to preventing torture and ill treatment, the most effective preventive measure is not merely to respond after the abuse occurs. It is to interrupt the process at its earliest stages, when stigmatizing labels, coordinated smear campaigns, dehumanizing rhetoric, and institutional pressure first emerge. So, preventing torture requires more than responding to individual acts of abuse. It requires identifying and addressing the institutional conditions that make abuse foreseeable. Systematic stigmatization is one such condition. Recognizing and addressing its part of the preventive obligations that states have already undertaken under international human rights law and within the OVCE framework. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Then I will try to represent my research about information terrorism. Yeah, my name is Evgenia Maletska. Yes, I am from Latvia and I am a lawyer, a former law enforcement officer and a human rights practitioner and a legal researcher. So for the past several years, my research has focused on the relationship between information influence, stigmatization, dehumanization. Yes. And this work has gradually developed into a broader criminological study of a phenomenon that I described as information terrorism. The concept did not emerge as an attempt to introduce new terminology. Rather, it evolved from the analysis of recurring empirical patterns observed over several years. Throughout today's discussion and during previous OVCE side events, we have spoken extensively about dehumanization, stigmatization, and the devastating consequences they bring. We have shared numerous examples of how labels destroy lives. However, today I would like to go further and share the results of my research, which has led me to clear understanding. These phenomena are not isolated acts of hatred. They are, in fact, information terrorism. After studying the nature of modern crimes, ranging from mass riots to acts of violence committed by lone actors, I have reached a fundamental conclusion. Any physical escalation is always preceded by a stage of information terrorism. There is not spontaneous outburst of aggression, but the result of systematic impact that I define as the prekinetic phase of conflict. Long before the first shot is fired, a mechanism of cognitive destabilization and the destruction of society psychological immunity is set in motion. Information terrorism serves as the functional foundation upon which the entire subsequent architecture of violence is built. It creates an environment in which physical acts become merely the final socially expected stage of criminal design.
What is the difference between classical terrorism and information terrorism? In classical terrorism, the primary tool is physical violence, explosion, hostage-taking, and killings. Its goal is immediate terror through the destruction of flesh and stone. Information terrorism, however, turns information itself into a weapon. Its goal is not to kill physically, at the initial stage, but to sow fear, doubt, and split society from within. While a classical terrorist acts directly, information terrorism utilizes the mechanism of delegated harm. The organizer creates the information environment, and the harm is carried out by others, radicalized groups, or even state institutions that have succumbed to manipulation. Allow me to briefly analyze the characteristics of information terrorism through the lens of the classical criminal offense structure. The first one, the object. Traditionally, criminal law prioritizes physical safety, viewing psychological impact as secondary. In my research, I propose a paradigm shift. In information terrorism, the additional object, psychological security and cognitive resilience, becomes functionally primary. It serves as the operational center of the entire attack. The perpetrator targets the mind and emotions first, because only by destroying society's psychological immunity can they successfully strike the direct object, public trust and the very legitimacy of state institutions. The second one, the objective side. This is not merely an opinion, it is a systematic, coordinated campaign. It involves the humanization and the use of stigmatizing labels and the creation of an enemy image. A critical warning sign here is when the label begins to replace evidence and reputation replaces facts. The third one, the subject. These can be individuals, complex networks, or structures using algorithms, bots, and media channels. They do not pull the trigger themselves. They create the conditions in which violence becomes justified. The third one, the subjective side. Moving to the subjective side, it is crucial to emphasize that we are not dealing with a mere opinion, but with direct and specific intent. The perpetrator does not simply share information. They consciously seek to destabilize the constitutional order and public safety. It is a deliberate manipulation that exploits our psychological vulnerabilities, such as the illusory truth effect, to bypass critical thinking and impose false concepts. The primary goal here is a social engineering through fear. This creates an atmosphere of so-called long-range terror, which effectively paralyzes the public's will to resist. However, the most dangerous element is the legitimization of the unacceptable. Information terrorism shifts the moral climate of country to the point where discrimination, persecution, or repression against a target group begin to seem justified or even necessary to save the state. This is the ultimate triumph of an information terrorist attack. When the destruction of trust and institutions occurs with the silent consent of an intermediate majority. In conclusion, I would like to issue a call to action to the global scientific and legal community. My research demonstrates that the phenomenon of information terrorism requires immediate and profound interdisciplinary study. We must acknowledge that the absence of the clear legal definition for information terrorism creates a dangerous vacuum that is being exploited by malicious actors. I propose that we move toward implementing information terrorism as a standalone legal norm with both national and international criminal codes. We cannot afford to wait for physical consequences to manifest. We must learn to identify this crime at its earliest stage, the stage of systematic dehumanization and cognitive manipulation. Only the timely legal qualification of information terrorism will allow us to build an effective legal barrier capable of interrupting the escalation of harm at its earliest stage. Left unaddressed, systematic campaigns of dehumanization and psychological coercion may escalate into ill treatment, torture, mass violence, crimes against humanity, and in the most extreme cases, genocide. Recognizing information terrorism as a standalone offense is not a restriction on freedom of expression. Rather, it is necessary legal safeguard to protect human dignity, democratic institutions, and every individual's fundamental rights to life, security, and freedom from torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment.